This video will review safe defrosting techniques in refrigeration. We'll talk about best practices in order to encourage our participants' behavior at home. Today we'll talk about proper storage techniques, about temperatures in your fridge, as well as how to safely defrost foods. As with any Cooking Matters class, we would like to try and gauge our participants' knowledge, and I usually like to begin by trying to ask them where they store their foods once they get home from the grocery store. The reason I ask this question is to gauge participants' knowledge on the topic, and remember to embrace all of the responses from the participants in order to encourage discussion. To start, I generally like to share where to store ready-to-eat versus raw foods in the fridge. That will lead to a discussion of what a raw food is versus a ready-to-eat food. Depending on your responses from your participants, you might want to share that a raw food is something like a chicken breast that requires additional cooking time in order to be safe to eat, versus a ready-to-eat food like this peach that only requires proper washing techniques in order to be eaten. As you're discussing this with your participants, you can talk about where to place ready-to-eat foods versus raw foods in your refrigerator. Now that we understand raw versus ready-to-eat foods, we can bring the participants over to the refrigerator. This is a good time to show participants where ready-to-eat foods need to be stored versus raw foods, and it's a good way to ask participants why we follow this method. Another great question to ask is, what is cross-contamination? Cross-contamination is where bacteria from raw foods can contaminate ready-to-eat foods and can lead to risk of foodborne illness. You'll notice that we have the chicken in a container in order to make sure that the juices don't run and contaminate the rest of your fridge, and they are under the ready-to-eat foods in order to minimize cross-contamination. When teaching this to participants, make sure to ask questions in order to provide clarification on why we use this method of refrigeration. Another important step to take is to make sure that your refrigerator is at the correct temperature for food safety, which is between 32 and 40 degrees. It is important to remind participants that food should be stored between 32 and 40 degrees to avoid the temperature danger zone, where bacteria can rapidly grow and they can be at risk of foodborne illness. When in class, you might want to use a nutrition tool in order to have your participants visualize how rapid bacteria growth can happen between 0 minutes to an hour and a half by using baggies full of raisins, so that they can actually understand what will happen with their food when not stored in the proper refrigeration temperature range. You may get questions from participants about how to make sure that their refrigerator is at the right temperature. And there are a couple ways to do this. You could use the refrigerator temperature gauge. Not all refrigerators have them. You could use a calibrated food thermometer to take the temperature of the refrigerator or of the food inside. Another option is to use a fridge thermometer to make sure your refrigerator is in the right temperature. Additionally, it is really important to make sure that your refrigerator is clean and free of spills. Next, we'll talk a little bit more about safe defrosting techniques, and this is a great way to ask your participants how they defrost their foods when they're at home. Once discussion begins, you can make clarifications on how these techniques can be used, and we want to make sure we cover the 4 topics on how to safely defrost our foods. One of those ways is through refrigeration. It does take a little bit of time and planning in order to make sure that your food is completely defrosted. Another way is to use cold water, and it has to be cold running water. It cannot be stagnant, so you can change out the water every 30 minutes until your food is completely thawed out. Another way is to use the microwave, and making sure that after you defrost it in the defrost setting, you want to cook your food immediately to make sure that it is safe to eat. Finally, another way is to cook from the frozen product. Take into account that it does take 50% more time, so you need to plan accordingly. Don't forget to discourage the use of the counter for defrosting. If you want to expand more on these topics, you could use your instructor guide, facilitator flipbook, or any of the toolkits available. Thank you for watching this video. As with any Cooking Matters lesson, remember to use facilitated dialogue and hands-on learning for our participants.